Hey guys, welcome to part 2 to What If Naruto was trained by the nine-tailed fox and became a female. If you just want to know what happened last part, then I'll be linking in the description down below, which take you to a playlist where you can watch part 1 and any other future part that gets added into this potential series. Of course, if you want this to become a What If graded then two parts. Anyway, with that out of the way, let's get into this. So, somewhat 6 or so months would somewhat go by as somewhat Iruka, pretty much Naruto's somewhat year's class would somewhat sensei would somewhat teach his students their first jutsu, that being the replacement jutsu, a relatively somewhat good jutsu, to start off and somewhat to learn, and one that would be indispensable to them in the far future. And yeah, so somewhat after that day, after that school day, Naruto somewhat asked Fox what he should kind of somewhat could do to it. Fox would just simply state, obviously master it, to which Naruto would go but how? And what necessarily do you mean by mastering a jutsu? How does one master a jutsu? Kura. To which Fox would state, well, there is in a way 2 different paths. Well, I guess 3, but one of them is pretty much the exact same as another one, so there's 2 different paths. Or at least you could say, 2 different paths with one similar path. Anyway, the one that is the same is the singular path, where you either master the chakra control required for the jutsu or the hand signs. And then there is, of course, which Naruto would finish off mastering both of them, which I guess you'd like me to do. Well, I would love for you to do that, but I would actually, for right now, I want you to actually master doing the jutsu without hand signs. I want you to understand the jutsu to a high enough degree that you don't need hand signs. That will, of course, increase your chakra control a bit. And yeah, Naruto is okay, but what about also the chakra control? You got you can continue doing that as well. It would just be it will be going somewhat harder on chakra control to obviously make up for the somewhat time lost now with somewhat learning a jutsu. It's like, well, but what about the day somewhat have for as a somewhat break? No. That day you have as a break is staying there. Naruto, you very much need a break. Anyone needs a break from training, as otherwise they will just get burnt out, and a burnt out trainee, somewhat shinobi, is absolutely useless and is more likely to get themselves killed than anything before. And yeah, but you're so young and that. Yes, but still, that can hurt your overall motivation of becoming a shinobi, or maybe even becoming Hokage, as when you burn out, you can start asking you questions, why am I really doing this? Is somewhat my dream even capable of, am I even capable of doing my dream? You start doubting yourself when you start getting burned out, and that just isn't good. So taking those days off can give you time to reflect over somewhat the training period, and also most people generally have days off to repair their body, to rest and repair, and whilst you physically don't need that, you mentally do. After all, your healing can only really heal you physically, not mentally. Naruto would just somewhat nod at that. He knew this would somewhat come in, as he'd asked it a couple of times before, but yeah. And so somewhat from there, a year and 2 months would go by, as Naruto would, of course, somewhat do what the fox said, and had mastered the replacement jutsu without requiring hand signs, which was very much handy, and also shortened the time of course and of jutsu activation from a second or so to milliseconds. And we're starting to dig into the microseconds, as somewhat though we didn't really prioritize jutsu activation. It was mainly now focusing on somewhat jutsu mastering the somewhat chakra controller aspect of it, getting it down to the absolute amount required for it. As though it was somewhat being seen as somewhat harder, as he necessarily didn't have the chakra control obviously to necessarily do so at the moment. And though of course though those 2 months or at least though of course after the year hit, the sensei had started teaching them about the transformation, the second jutsu. Though the Fox had told him to keep with it, with the replacement for right now, and only use the class time to train in the transformation, which he did up to the 2-month mark, which is current, to where the Fox would now tell him to focus on the transformation, get that down to master that, which Naruto would ask again somewhat to it. Fox would state that there's kind of 3 different, or at least 4 different levels of mastery. Well, 3. There's the chakra control aspect. There's the hand sign, no hand sign requirement, which Fox would state that it would be focusing on first, and then there's the I can transform into anything I see and feel for the first time. And he'd state that would be his main thing he'd be working towards once he could get the hand signs down to not requiring them at all. Do somewhat trying to transform into anything is going to be the main priority, as being able to transform into a bird you've only seen in a book, or a fairy tale creature with maybe an ability to breathe underwater or fly through the sky. It'd somewhat be useful in a way. And and so of course Naruto also had some time carved out of his schedule for pranks, of course, as well, as he'd started doing that when he was 5 or 6. Don't really remember. I said it in the last part 1. Anyway, from of course there, another year would go by, as it'd be now 8 years old. 7, 8, no, it'd be 9 now. I can't do maths. He was 7 when he's, he was technically 6, so he would technically be 8. It'd be somewhat 8, as the Fox would somewhat now tell him, or at least with the his class, or at least his academy teacher now teaching them their 3rd and final jutsu that he'd teach the class, that being the clone jutsu, or at least mainly showing them the hand signs and that, cause to which Naruto pretty much it didn't really work. It was more or less pretty much like smoke, pretty much fog no jutsu. It'd be better off calling it than clone jutsu. Though the Fox had kind of waited about a month with Naruto struggling to kind of get some type of control of the jutsu, and which would somewhat be now, as the Fox would tell him that or it'd somewhat be waiting for the battle to go, which would signify the end of the school day, school/academy day, as the Fox would tell him that he should go to the fired Hokage, to which Naruto would ask, why should he go to the old man? And yeah, to which Fox would state that if you somewhat tell him something about you, or something isn't not able to do it, it's like, but I've only been doing it, a month. It's like, yes, a month. And if you're forgetting, your chakra is massive, Naruto. It's wrong word. It's mammoth. It is, full compared to someone, amongst your other peers, your other classmates. It's mammoth. Compared to the other type beasts, it's compared to me, it's a small amount. Small, whereas compared to the one-tails, and that it's maybe somewhat a okay size. Yeah. Anyway, though of course somewhat for you not having somewhat that much control, but not all that much control, and once you've done once you've done a lot, and somewhat before you start arguing about, you should have been doing harder chakra control, you should have been pushing me more in chakra control. If I did push you to do chakra control a lot harder, you'd be 20 by the time you could do the clone jutsu, Naruto. If you go to the third, making someone realise that you have a fucking large chakra reserves, and sure, that may end up requiring a different shinobi to someone coming to verify your actual chakra reserves. But once that's done, he'll probably may give you a jutsu. He may either tell you that he will, but once you turn 11 or 12, when you need to graduation, to become a genin. But trying to argue to him that doing it that close would prevent you from kind of truly learning it, and he may not, with your as large as your reserves are, you may still not even be able to actually do it. Potentially by then, so that would somewhat go well okay. But what if he doesn't? Well, I don't know then becoming a genin in any reasonable amount of time is going to look impossible then, Naruto. Naruto would sigh and from there, or at least you'd hear the bell go, and from there Iruka would dismiss them, and Naruto would head over to the Hokage's tower and up into the third office. And after a somewhat chat turned argument turned somewhat chat again, Naruto would end up somewhat leaving, and then an hour later coming back, giving Hiruzen the scroll. The same scroll that Hiruzen had gave him, which was the Shadow Clone Jutsu. Yeah, Hiruzen would be actually shocked that he'd gotten it done. He said, you've learned it already, and he'd go, I can do it. Doing it and actually having it somewhat be truly useful is different. Somewhat different. Hiruzen would somewhat nod at that, and they talk for a bit. Not really anything interesting. And yeah, from there, Naruto would of course, the Fox would have Naruto do that, train that until he could do it, without doing the hand sign. And yeah, though of course that wouldn't take him all that long, maybe a week or a month, as he's done it with 2 jutsus now, so yeah, he was starting to really pick up the pace in being able to learn a jutsu without doing the hand signs. And yeah, And well, yeah, the somewhat though Naruto would somewhat, well, the fox would be mulling over potential possibility, as it'd be a temporary way of him to leave, though leaving with, his chakra within Naruto could potentially be somewhat dangerous, as his chakra would be, it'd go potentially wild, and yeah, so it wasn't 100% sure. So it would end up somewhat, though he would, or at least somewhat, seeing Naruto's kind of level of control of the somewhat shadow clone jutsu and that, it would end up somewhat bringing Naruto into his mind, and would somewhat tell him somewhat his kind of idea that they may be able to use the shadow clone jutsu in a way to kind of bring him out, to which Naruto would kind of say that wouldn't that kill him, to which the fox would shake his head, saying that his chakra, the main actual thing that would keep him alive, and that the key part someone would actually leave his body, and that only his consciousness or that sort would, which would potentially mean that his chakra would be potentially harder to control or that, but that'd be a future thing, to which Naruto would somewhat nod. And yeah, anyway, it can and oh yeah, so from there somewhat few would of course go by, with Naruto thus officially becoming, well, he would not only somewhat 9, but he would end up, or at least it would take them some time, as he would end up becoming 10 years old. And yeah, and it'd be about a month after his 10th birth. Well, yeah, that would be January, February, March. Yeah, January, because his birthday's 10th of October, so yeah. Anyway, yeah, so with it now being January, and of course him being 10, that, and well, something they'd be outside as somewhat Naruto would pace somewhat. He'd somewhat close his eyes and concentrate, as he'd somewhat say shadow clone jutsu, and in a somewhat, and yeah, you'd hear somewhat voice, and his eyes would somewhat open, and he'd go, "It actually, right, we've finally done it. Kuro, we've finally done it." As yeah, it was currently about around 2 p.m. Somewhat, in the evening, as Naruto would, the fox would somewhat go, "Indeed, you have somewhat done it. I'm finally somewhat able to, be able to somewhat move around somewhat on my own." Yeah, though the fox somewhat would kind of put his hands together and would somewhat slightly alter the transformation, or at least the clone's body to more to slightly more, be comfortable in it. And yeah, though the fox would simply, you'd go, "Though I've been thinking of something, Naruto, and I'd like you to, or at least somewhat, though for me to tell you, you're somewhat gonna have to go to somewhat your apartment." Or why can't you just tell me out here? Because there's the chance of people listening. And yeah, Naruto would nod at that, and somewhat from there the fox would dispel, and Naruto would head back into his home. Once he'd somewhat arrive home and be in his somewhat living room, and while in a somewhat small puff of smoke, the fox would form once more, already somewhat sitting down on the somewhat couch slash somewhat Naruto also somewhat sitting down would kind of ask the fox what this thing was, to which it state that, of course, somewhat or at least somewhat his that somewhat training thing, as he wouldn't be learning any ninjutsu for somewhat 2 years. That somewhat it would be somewhat it would be somewhat the, or at least like somewhat utilizing a already, or somewhat, or at least some somewhat a bit. It'd somewhat be utilizing his somewhat sexy jutsu to its natural. Blink and be somewhat confused, and you'd go, "What about the sexy jutsu? And how's that going to somewhat help me? How am I going to train in that?" Well, firstly, the first main thing is that you're going to have to somewhat firstly get a job. With somewhat the requirement of something utilizing the your sexy jutsu, what you need to find a job as that they would know it's me. Well, not quite. We're not exactly utilizing the sexy jutsu, or at least your sexy jutsu form. What we're utilizing is the gender of it. You mean, so you want me to find a job as a girl? Well, female, woman, yes. More so woman, not girl, but yeah. That would be slightly confused on girl, but doesn't girl and woman mean the same thing? Well, girl is more reserved for somewhat 14, 15-year-old somewhat kids and younger, and then somewhat woman is more of a somewhat 15 plus mark. Or at least somewhat any child with, or at least somewhat any somewhat female person somewhat with that's kind of more acting like an adult will generally get the similarly, or at least title going from girl to woman, as woman is more of a kind of somewhat adult terminology for somewhat females, whilst the same goes for somewhat males. It's man or boy or man. Yeah, now to go. Okay. Anyway, so yes, you're going to be somewhat getting a job as a woman. The reason why is, well, it'll help you in this somewhat future and potential future missions. How? Well, somewhat put it this way now. Well, you slightly somewhat understand as I somewhat explained. Firstly, we'll somewhat create a actual somewhat woman form that nobody will know is you. They'd look at you and see a woman, maybe some beautiful one at that. And yeah, this will be your somewhat female form. Of course, you still have your somewhat sexy jutsu form, which is for whatever you want to use it for. But this female form will be whatever. So if you're ever called in, to do a Konoichi mission, that's somewhat your female form and that. And yeah, plus there are some jobs you'd somewhat have, or at least. Somewhat I have, or at least there are some jobs that, of course, I would somewhat, well, not exactly jobs I would like you to do, more or less you pick one of them to do. But firstly, let's get your female form done, as that can take the longer. Well, it would be the more important thing to do right this second. Not with someone nowadays. From there, the fox would already start telling Naruto to get someone undressed, which Naruto would kind of go, I can do it with my clothes. And it's like, yes, I know you can, anyone can, but if you haven't noticed it, most people, if they're transforming, tend to transform their body and their clothes. They don't, transform, they somewhat transform. Like if they, transform, say if they're going to transform into a girl, they'll transform into a girl with clothes, not a naked girl, as it's somewhat, kind of somewhat harder. It's more taxing to, somewhat do that than it is to just, get yourself naked and transform, as the chocolate cost is lowered a fair bit when you are somewhat already naked. and you'll transform from naked to, like, from being naked male to naked female. That, and I'll be able to see the changes a lot somewhat easier. That would someone just go, okay. And dude, someone close his eyes as someone the fox would. Well, yeah, as the fox would someone tell him to transform into his sex future form, and then from there they will somewhat alter it. And yeah, the sort first, well, yeah, sort after that, the first thing that would go would be his whisk marks. As the fox would go, your somewhat whisk marks, lose them. You don't need them. It's the main thing how they're able to recognize you. After someone would do so, and somewhat from there you'd go and also make yourself somewhat smaller, 5'2.5". Afterwards, again, sort of just nod as he'd make himself. It's sort of think, well, yeah, sort of smaller from about 5'10" or that. Yeah, his sexy jutsu is about 5'10", isn't it? I'd think so. Anyway, yeah, somewhat from there would make himself 5'2.5", like the fox said, and then somewhat from there, somewhat though afterwards, like grown as somewhat he had like double D cut for somewhat low, but or actually he'd probably have a larger chest than that even. They do definitely seem a lot larger. Yeah, anyway. So the fox would tell him to make them sort of seek up to it, and I'd go, huh? What do you mean? As the fox would sort of sigh, as he'd perceive to somewhat casually, seemingly make mainly somewhat transform a piece of somewhat Nato's sort of clothing into a somewhat fabric tape measure, as he'd perceive to somewhat measure out somewhat Nato's kind of sort of chest band, as he doesn't plan to really heavily change like the Nato's kind of like figure all that much, maybe slightly wider hips or that, but yeah. Anyway, you'd then sort of tell, or at least you'd somewhat calculate the size of somewhat in his head before you'd simply dump the information to somewhat Nato's head, and more so a actual picture on how large they should now be. Which now would go, oh, that size, okay, and would perceive to somewhat, as Chester would perceive to somewhat shrink, and his posture would somewhat change, being a lot somewhat more at least better, and he'd somewhat his hand would also somewhat massage his back somewhat, going, oh, that feels better. And yeah, then somewhat from there, he'd somewhat then tell Naruto to lighten it, somewhat up his skin colour a bit more to a more creamy white. To which somewhat he would, and they would then somewhat change his eye colour from the somewhat bright blue to a deep blue, to a somewhat more kind of deeper, somewhat darker blue, with somewhat a hint of grey to them. So a kind of somewhat dark, a somewhat deep dark, a kind of dark, somewhat greyish blue, slightly greyish blue. And then somewhat from there, somewhat the fox would have now to lighten up his blonde, well, not blonde, more so yellow hair, which would make it somewhat, more basically somewhat more slightly natural blonde hair, and would then somewhat have him also add a tiny bit, or at least a bit of brown into the mix as well. And then somewhat after that, and after having him somewhat lengthen his hair, and also slightly, a bit of, and slightly, somewhat, a tiny bit of widen somewhat hips, but somewhat nothing, somewhat too extreme or that. And yeah, from there, somewhat, then somewhat kind of, somewhat drag Naruto into his actually room, to which Naruto, though the fox would tell him to keep his eyes shut, to the point of where something Naruto would feel his body stop moving, and something the fox would then tell him to open his eyes, to which he'd somewhat open up and somewhat kind of gasp out of somewhat, surprised in that, and he goes, "Is that me?" And the fox go, that's the thing I forgot. Somewhat and Naruto would then sort of turn to the fox and kind of go from shock to confusion. And yeah, and then it sort of hit him, his voice. It still sounded like it's like jutsu form. And so from there, the fox would somewhat, of course, sort of now to somewhat onto somewhat his voice. His jutsu voice. To similarly, a different pitch and tone in that. Though still very much absolutely soft in that. And after that, Naruto would really look at him, herself, and yeah. And though from there, Naruto would just be kind of shocked at just seemingly almost how beautifully her seemed, and though the fox would tell him to her at the moment to go over to his bed and sit there as he'd go and tell him the somewhat jobs, to which Naruto would kind of state that wouldn't they kind of interfere with training and or the academy, mainly the academy, to which fox would go, well, that's the thing they want. Yeah, they may hamper training a bit, as we won't be able to train as late, but that's somewhat fine, as be fine. And also these jobs are mainly to get you more kind of comfortable with your kind of female form, as in the future it will probably be utilised a potential fair amount, or just being a female in general will probably be utilised more. Not to be slightly confused, but to just nod. One team's made up of 2 men and 1 female, or at least generally, when possible, 2 boys to 1 girl. And from what he could think of, this academy year would indeed hold that standard of 2 boys to 1 girl. And though the function telling about the first job, which these are all kind of night-based jobs, to which Naruto would somewhat nod. You'd go, well, the first one is the one that requires, in a way, the least amount of training from me, in a somewhat way. The least amount of training from me, as it'd be mainly getting experience, or at least you would be kind of getting hands-on experience. And that is being a prostitute. What? You want me to go about having sex with men, people? Folks would somewhat wince and go, well, yeah, it's mainly to obviously it help you in seduction. Do you mind? I'm trying to explain. And the fox would just kind of not to start him with his kind of twitching and that's and though why do I have to do some seduction? Aren't teams generally made out made with the concept of 2 boys to 1 girl, and from, if my maths isn't wrong, there's enough, and it's in my year to do that. Isn't that well true? But if you remember, well, what one of your classmates, be it say you and Sasuke, and pick one of the, pick one of the girls, in your classroom that's going to be, I'll transform myself into an adult woman and, somewhat, do, casually, seduce a somewhat male for the team. Something like that, and, that would go, you'd she'd kind of stay there, somewhat trying to think. And and the front go there is none, isn't there? It is somewhat that are all pretty much Sasuke fangirls, and yes, I know besides one which is somewhat Hinata, those she's too damn shy, and well, yeah, should be, well, yeah, should probably pass out just by somewhat asking her to, or at least somewhat by that concept alone. And yeah, afterwards somewhat let her side out, nod, something like that, plus you're Shinobi, and also somewhat think about it this way: if you ever getting chased, you can easily, somewhat, go into a crowd of a lot of people and easily transform yourself, into somewhat a female, and somewhat that, and somewhat the experience of like a year as a somewhat female will help you to more better be, feminine, to act more feminine, that, so they would completely somewhat, completely ignore the fact that you, or at least somewhat, it wouldn't even come across to them that you're actually, the person they were chasing. That would once more sort of nod. And yeah. And from there you'd go anyway. It's not obviously somewhat I do have more than just somewhat that job on my somewhat on the somewhat list you could do. And somewhat that in the order of somewhat least more somewhat kind of training required from me, with the somewhat last one requiring the most training from me, but is the least likely for you to wind up having sex with someone, whilst the first one obviously is the one that you're going to 100% wind up having sex, and the least amount of help somewhat from training from me. And yeah, that would somewhat nod as it'd go, wait, but you said, you somewhat kind of said, or at least that, or at least somewhat when you finally transformed into somewhat a human, that is your first time transforming into somewhat human, and or at least humanoid or that, and you'd go, I kind of had somewhat forgotten that, and I still technically wasn't exactly all wrong with that statement. And I'd go, what do you mean? Well, when I was a lot younger, how younger? When I was about 10 or so years old, human years, of course, as Fox is practically, Toby's practically immortal, so they're going to use the human years to quote their age. Yeah, and that would not go wide-eyed, and the Fox would go, well, yeah, when I was about 10, they, I pretty much said somewhat I'd learned how, or at least I'd figured out how to transform myself into something humanoid. It wasn't my first time, but that sort of transformation was into something a female. Why do you think the somewhat the or at least somewhat the saying, or at least somewhat about like kitsune, that somewhat kitsune tend to transform into beautiful somewhat women that will seduce, somewhat will come out and to seduce men into their lair. I'd go, hey, that was you? Well, yeah, it was caused by me, yeah. Yeah, and that would just somewhat kind of just stared dumbfoundedly at the Fox. Though then again, there's a chance that it were also caused by other kitsune, though I highly doubt, other somewhat sentient foxes, which would be called kitsune, I guess. What do you mean by somewhat others? Well, there's some, summoning clans, and somewhat back then, I didn't necessarily obviously somewhat know, but as I continue to, somewhat walk around the somewhat human, or at least, and somewhat, or at least amongst the humans, as somewhat, when I somewhat grow to somewhat new about some of these kind of summoning clans or that, or, not really summoning clans, but yeah, though they're still very much, summoning clan, animal summoning clans that I don't know exist. Is there a fox one out there? Potentially, maybe. It's possible. And yeah. Now they'd sort of just nod. Anyway, back to the sort of job thing. I'd go, oh, right. Well, as I was saying, the first one would be sort of you, as going out being a prostitute. The sort of benefits of that, as I state the benefits, then the negatives. The benefit is that, for one, it's the least amount of help, training for something from me. So, that'll help you in seduction, somewhat both, somewhat physically, as in somewhat the way you walking out mentally or verbally, in other words, so not using your voice to seduce men. That also, my mind's drawing a blank now. Also being able to think more clearly through sort of pleasure and even somewhat orgasm, that, and even able to potentially control the point where you orgasm. That, and yeah, I think that's what it. Oh, and you're sort of your own boss, meaning that you pretty much, if you don't, you somewhat choose, hey, I'll somewhat work, tonight, and then be like 3 days later when you work somewhat the next night, and maybe 5 days after that, or a week or two afterwards. You choose when you want to, go out and have people pay to get pay to use your vagina. Yeah, not the well. Next is that you're somewhat more likely to be somewhat raped. That, and less likely to kind of get help from somewhat passers-by, as somewhat, well, if they see, a person similarly somewhat raping you, that men and that potentially have a somewhat higher chance at, somewhat, especially somewhat, if the man goes, this is, someone's just a, prostitute or something like that, are more likely then to kind of join in sort of the kind of free sex, pretty much. And yeah, so the next one is pretty much, you're still pretty much technically a prostitute. It's just that you're pretty much working the building in others, pretty much a whorehouse. Where pretty much you'd be somewhat around other somewhat women. And they'd somewhat be an old one, generally referred to as somewhat the mother of the house. And that clients will somewhat pay her, or at least these somewhat men would come in to leave somewhat the building, pay somewhat her to somewhat pretty much use one of you, and somewhat use would somewhat you would then go somewhat inside into somewhat a building, or into somewhat a room to which they would then arrive to and use whatever hole they or at least however they somewhat kind of please or that. And yeah, be that somewhat pretty much be that to have sex in, or at least somewhat to use your somewhat vagina, or to use your somewhat vagina, your ass, or your mouth, or as somewhat the sex terms are, the somewhat vaginal, anal, or oral. Not with somewhat pale at that, but with more somewhat pale and kind of nod. And yeah, sometimes you'd have to take maybe 2 or even 3, which would mean both of you, somewhat your vagina and ass, or all 3. And somewhat be, filled with dicks. And yeah, that would somewhat nod. And though this one next one is a somewhat strip club, that would somewhat mainly somewhat help you in hang on, so you didn't say the positive or negatives. They're somewhat slightly the same as being a prostitute. The somewhat different is that because you're not pretty much seeking out, you're not, doing really seduction. The only seduction you could really do is verbal, maybe a tiny bit of physical or somewhat seduction using your body, but it's mainly going to be verbal seduction and mainly helping you to deal with somewhat pleasure and somewhat orgasm and yeah. The slight downside is that you pretty much are there working potentially every day or every night, and yeah. Anyway, the next one, as I said, strip club is pretty much all definitely help you more, somewhat, or at least somewhat being able to seduce somewhat by somewhat walking, more so dancing, having somewhat building up a somewhat seductive dance, and yeah, also getting you somewhat more comfortable in kind of somewhat and freely showing your somewhat body off. Not to go home, so I'm fine, I'm not to be somewhat confused and go, what do you mean by that? Well, look down at yourself. That would somewhat blink and somewhat would, and would somewhat be slightly surprised. As somewhat doing that talk, now to would always doing somewhat that talk, mainly the fox talking. So now to would somewhat had moved his his legs, somewhat had one over somewhat the other, somewhat trying to pretty much somewhat hide his vagina / pussy, and somewhat had his arms kind of crossed over somewhat breasts or her breasts, to somewhat hide the kind of nipples, again trying to preserve some level of somewhat modesty there. And yeah, and that would somewhat try and slightly command his arms to somewhat release and his legs to move somewhat apart, slightly get him slightly more comfortable, but it's somewhat hard. Heck, you'd also notice that his heart was also somewhat beating somewhat rapidly. Didn't know why, and it had been somewhat for a while now. He'd somewhat realised, and yeah. Anyway, though, he'd kind of those vibes go anyway. Move somewhat carrying on. Benefits that is somewhat, well, is going there is that to somewhat build up ability to somewhat be able to kind of somewhat seductively, or at least somewhat be able to kind of it somewhat definitely help you in the seductive part when it came to somewhat body, not much verbally. Also somewhat your skills at getting naked, as somewhat a strip club is mainly somewhat you somewhat pole dancing, where you'd either start off somewhat kind of somewhat sexily, or at least with some somewhat clothes on, to winding up with it somewhat finishing, or at least somewhat the routine somewhat finishing and you being completely naked, to you just starting off naked and finishing naked. So yeah, of course somewhat that has a high chance at of course somewhat sex as you are naked, but it's not a guaranteed somewhat sex and that. And yeah, though not that, and yeah, so that of course some work potentially every night, probably every night, and well yeah, some disadvantages and potentially some more. So next one is pretty much nightclub. Generally the same. The only difference is that you just don't get naked. Like doing the routine, it's just straight up. You're always somewhat clothed in somewhat outfits. The only difference is that, or at least somewhat prior, or at least when someone asks you for a private dance, you'd go into somewhat a back room, which is a somewhat private room, where then somewhat you can decide how much clothed you want to be it somewhat being clothed is somewhat you are doing the dance, to being completely potentially somewhat naked with only the somewhat shoes on. And yeah, again the somewhat same benefits to and somewhat disbenefits and negatives. I did something nod. And so from there, 1, 2, 3, 4, yeah, so the last one, the fifth one, would be actually working in a casino. huh? A casino? What would that help me with? Well, something that all helps you with getting comfortable in your somewhat as your kind of female self, and that is or at least that would give you the sort of the main sort way, getting of just being sort of calm, not calm, but getting used to just being somewhat female, being referred to as somewhat a female, and of course a female name that once you choose you're going to stick to. It's your pretty much birth. Say it'd be like if you were somewhat a sort of female, that would be your sort of name at birth, pretty much. And that would go go okay. Still, it would just somewhat help me with getting used to being sort of female. Yeah, that, and while also potentially being touched somewhat slightly sexually. And yeah, but otherwise that would somewhat generally be it. Mainly, or at least its main thing will be sort of, or at least sort of verbally, somewhat seductiveness, as there is more different types of seductiveness, though it generally goes under a different name. So that being manipulation. After all, a casino is somewhat owned mainly by people spending somewhat money, so thus would be mainly somewhat learning not only to, or at least somewhat, be comfortable as somewhat a woman, but also how to manipulate these somewhat people into using, into, spending money, and yeah. And well, yeah, that of course somewhat negative. Again, you'll pretty much be working every night, though that's pretty much it, as you have you have of course a much higher chance at actual people helping you out if somebody tries to rape you, and yeah, that would sort of nod, and it sort of I should somewhat ask how or at least long those decide to pick one of those, which the functions that you have somewhat a week, and if you don't get a job by the by the end of the somewhat, or at least by Sunday, by Sunday exactly on midnight Sunday, midnight, if you don't have a job by then, you'll default to a prostitute, as after all you are your own boss, though I'd technically somewhat be the boss. That would somewhat gulp and would somewhat nod at that, and well, of course, and so thus from that a week would go by, and it'd be 2 hours from exactly midnight, so it'd be 10 o'clock when or at least a person would tell her that would tell Naruto, or well, as she's now decided on, Lily, Lily or Lilith. So Lily, that should be someone who's hiding, and that should be a possible working tomorrow night. So it should nod, and and so from that night, the fox would remind that she only had the fox would go, wow, well done, as you only had 2 hours left until you pretty much became prostitute for a year. Yeah, so it's sign relief, though the fox even though she kind of sighed, it was more like, she was like more or less Naruto's mind. It's like, I have to have sex with people. True, he wouldn't, but well, it'd go from being with people to more object wise, as well. Yeah, the fox would, after probably a few months of and Naruto obviously being physically a lot more comfortable, as a woman, would definitely get Naruto to either get Naruto or just transform into, or at least have Naruto make a shadow clone for him to inhabit, and then someone, or at least pulling him out of someone, his body, and he'd go, transform into a woman and go and, buy dildo and that. For someone very much Naruto to very much stalk, because, you're still going to have to obviously someone teach you seductiveness and seductive, and so on. And obviously seductive can very much lead into sex, as somewhat more times than not, sex was very much required as a somewhat kind of trade. Somewhat you want information, and somewhat in return, so I get to, rack your body. It's pretty much, yeah. And, yeah. And so, somewhat from there, about 6 months would go by, as well, it was somewhat very much obvious that Naruto had definitely gotten comfortable as a somewhat female, as he'd somewhat should be kind of just somewhat similarly laying in the bath at the moment with somewhat hair tied up in a somewhat high bun for it to not get wet. As he'd somewhat be kind of looking up somewhat to the ceiling, and somewhat wonder, somewhat ask the fox what they'd be training into, training someone tomorrow. As the fox would go, well, I have an idea, but you're gonna have to somewhat make you're gonna have to pull me somewhat out of your body, so that I can get somewhat a few things. Should somewhat be and go, oh, what things? Maybe I can. It's better if I get them. You be somewhat hesitant, or maybe try and argue that you don't need them or that. Should be somewhat confused and yeah, but would somewhat nod. And so somewhat from there, the fox would somewhat, or at least next morning, fox would get them and would somewhat hide them away in somewhat Naruto's apartment, where Naruto wouldn't find them. Yeah. Though somewhat when the fox would return to Naruto would somewhat be out somewhat doing a bit of just somewhat physical exercise in the somewhat morning, with it being generally somewhat early, so he'd somewhat be doing some push-ups, sit-ups and that. And yeah, though somewhat Naruto would notice somewhat the slight increase in chakra, and would go, so you back, what did you get? You somewhat need to know that for at least another somewhat bit. Though somewhat once you're somewhat done, head on somewhat back to the somewhat apartment. Head on somewhat back home. And yeah, Naruto would just go okay, and so about somewhat half an hour later, Naruto would somewhat return home, to which the fox would somewhat time to very much have a shower, maybe shower that, wash off the smell and that. Naruto would do so, and after coming back now somewhat clean, and the fox would already be somewhat formed as he'd done so, with obviously the fox telling him to have a shower or that. Yeah. From there, the fox would somewhat tell Naruto to kind of sit down, to which Naruto would do so and would ask, and would somewhat be kind of confused. And so the kind of next thing, or at least he knew his heart was somewhat racing a somewhat mile a minute, and then he'd be glaring at the fox, going, damn it, Kurama, why did you have to hit me over the head? Well, I very much could have easily have just somewhat had sex with you right then and there. That would somewhat blink and would go, and would then sort of realise it'd go, right, somewhat seduced you. And somewhat from this somewhat point for maybe 6 months or so, somewhat will be helping you, or at least trying somewhat to help you in to somewhat you to get better at somewhat resisting somewhat being seduced, as well. Yeah, it's, obviously somewhat, if you can easily get seduced, well, that's going to be a huge problem, especially if you plan to be a Hokage. Well, you have to be, somewhat immune to somewhat seductiveness, and well, I'm pretty much I somewhat, thing or two to it. That was somewhat snort. That was seemingly an understatement. And yeah, though he wouldn't call the fox out, and yeah. And somewhat, though the fox would state, though I'm not just going to obviously just do it somewhat female, of course. Somewhat, of course not. That'd just be, somewhat stupid. As after all, men can also do seductiveness, and whilst it is to a much somewhat kind of lesser degree, as while it's generally pointless trying to seduce a sort of woman, as there's somewhat a woman to, like with any somewhat brain, seductiveness generally doesn't work. But, well, yeah, with you, and well, somewhat with you obviously generally being, with you somewhat being a male, it's more than likely going to work if you're transforming into your female form. So that's what I want you to do now. That would do so, and after a small somewhat cloud of smoke forming between both Naruto and the fox transforming, the fox alternates somewhat its form to now be male, while somewhat Naruto would enter his female form, aka somewhat Lily, his Lilith form. And yeah. And then somewhat from there, somewhat the next thing, somewhat once more, that would be somewhat rubbing his head to a somewhat now somewhat slight burning sensation between his legs, and it also felt somewhat wet, and yeah, it would also be slightly somewhat rubbing them to somewhat together, and to go, damn it, go away in hell, did you whack me over the head again? Well, somewhat once more, could have had sex with you, though this time you'd be the one spreading your legs, and yeah, don't think you somewhat wanted to come to experiencing what it was like to have a penis inside of you, a dick inside of you, and also a orgasm. Plus, what you're currently feeling is somewhat somewhat what any someone feel somewhat feels like when they start to be turned on, when they start to really someone just nodding. So from that, time would go by, to which the fox, after a somewhat month, or at least after about 2 to 3 months, or at least 4 months more so, the somewhat fox would notice that Naruto seemingly wasn't progressing seemingly as fast as somebody as he / she or someone was doing when it came to chakra control, and also being used to being sort of female and that, and he felt like something Naruto very much more or less somewhat knew the sort of states that he could end up being raped and that, but the fox knew maybe the sort of verbal somewhat warning, and that wasn't necessarily enough. Maybe he should at least somewhat take Naruto all the way up, or at least in his female form, all the way up to near orgasmic somewhat release. Somewhat riding that thin line between having an orgasm and not, and then simply stopping and watching someone as Naruto has to tolerate and somewhat deal with the now somewhat declining somewhat pleasure as it wasn't released. And yeah, that would be more than torturous, somewhat enough to not get that release. While somewhat his male form, while he can just somewhat easily somewhat seduce and something, wear, or at least something, something wear lipstick, and someone just simply kiss him, something, on the cheek or something like that. More so, something to mark him, so that, well, at least once, the fox whacked him around the head. So much so than just, something how bad it kind of seemingly was. And yeah, so with that, we didn't tell Naruto, of course. And yeah, one moment, Naruto, or someone new, pumping in the next, he felt his cheeks somewhat tingly, and yeah, Fox would just simply tell him to go and look in the mirror. He somewhat would, and he'd go, "What the hell? What the hell did you actually, I thought you said you wouldn't, have sex with me, all that," and go, I didn't. I just somewhat, kiss you on your cheeks. And yeah, if you don't start to truly improve, actually try and improve, I have been, no you haven't, and I know you haven't, Naruto, I know for a fact, you can progress a lot faster than how you currently are. Yeah, so I'm going to be continuing to do this. And if you don't simply start to truly start improving and take this seriously, then I may very much take your virginity away from you. I do it somewhat slightly gone about that, and would nod, and he'd somewhat wonder what the fox would do. As yeah. Though after somewhat washing the lipstick the fox used off, he'd go back and once more would, after a couple of minutes, return back to the bathroom to remove the lipstick. And after a similarly an hour of doing so, Fox would then switch and would go remove some of the lipstick or what was potentially left of it. And then someone shift into the fox into his male form, and that would turn into his female form. And from there, well, it was somewhat that had his mind. From that to going from near somewhat just orgasmic, to somewhat near and somewhat orgasm to going from an orgasm to then the slow and somewhat, and then nothing, and yeah, it's somewhat absolutely torturous for that. And also Fox also found out that somewhat Naruto, or at least seemingly at certain points, seemingly lost almost all, seemingly somewhat all control, as somewhat Naruto even started to talk semi-seductive back. And yeah, definitely somewhat giving Fox an idea that at a certain level of somewhat pleasure, Naruto seemingly somewhat or at least seemingly just stopped thinking at all and purely let somewhat emotion, somewhat emotion do the thinking. And yeah, from there, though somewhat after just the first month alone, the Fox would indeed see somewhat improvement. Granted, Naruto somewhat wouldn't, as it seemed to be the same difficulty, but Fox was ramping up, having to try harder. Granted, not all that much harder, but still harder to seduce Naruto. That, and also the fact the somewhat the amount of pleasure, or at least how somewhat close Naruto could get to near, or at least to somewhat orgasmic, to the percentages of somewhat how much pleasure he kind of somewhat has and how close he is to being, or at least experiencing a somewhat orgasm, until somewhat his mind was kind of overcome and pleasure started, and pleasure, took the hand. That was also somewhat increasing, and somewhat the Fox hoped to completely rid somewhat his emotions, or at least the somewhat pleasure emotion, from taking control, as that would, it wouldn't exactly be good. And yeah, And well, yeah. Anyway, though as the summer would then sort of kind of come around. Well, no, summer would have already come, though as summer had been having his birthday, the fox would decide to somewhat introduce Naruto to what he actually bought. And yeah, Naruto would just somewhat freeze as he'd somewhat realise, or at least he'd be somewhat confused. A somewhat glass bit, or a something that looked potentially glass-like, somewhat penis, and a kind of floppy, rubbery one as well, and somewhat odd shape. You know, that kind of looked like a somewhat slightly inverse, somewhat heart, though less heart-shaped and more kind of like teardrop simile, though not exactly somewhat like that, more so in the opposite direction, where it went somewhat large, then small, then kind of rapidly large again, then to a somewhat more gentle kind of slope down. Yeah, the fox would state that, and seemingly some fluid as well in a somewhat bottle. And yeah, that would somewhat look at the fox kind of confused, as the fox would state that these are more amply known as somewhat sex toys, and Naruto would somewhat immediately realise somewhat the tinge of somewhat red that would somewhat mark his cheeks, as well. It would, well, yeah, he'd, well, besides from someone getting out of the bath and now being in somewhat night to her and somewhat to his female self. Yeah, and somewhat the fox would somewhat tell him that or at least somewhat that if he'd gone with, you know, being a sort of prostitute, you know, that obviously someone would help him with a seduction and be the ability to tolerate, you know, some pleasure, that to which Naruto would state that he kind of wasn't he, to which the fox would state that's more so verbal, and that the somewhat difference between pleasure from, you know, verbally and physically was definitely a difference. And yeah, that and the fact that you know, seduction didn't necessarily always guarantee you'd get information, as of some other somewhat, and almost most of the time you'd have to indeed indulge in somewhat sex as a trade, as continued good. So the traded somewhat more or less sparked from, you know, trying to seduce the person would almost guarantee to be information somewhat for a form of sex, be it oral, anal or vaginal. More times than not it tends to be either somewhat oral, also known as blowjob, or vaginal. And yeah, though sometimes some people do indeed go for the somewhat R-sex, anal sex, so you are indeed going to have to get used to all three forms. So the floppy one is very much for your mouth and getting you used to somewhat deep throating. The somewhat glass is for pretty much all three, as once you get used to deep throating, the latex one, the latex floppy one, you would then go to the somewhat glass one, where it's somewhat much thicker, not all that much longer, but definitely a lot thicker. And yeah, to then simulate one, of course the floppy one, to simulate, you know, a floppy dick, as more than likely most men will have you do a blowjob on them to get their dick hard, and may indeed have a somewhat continue the blowjob up until the point of where they're nearing either some orgasm, or where they're somewhat release pregum, to which then they'd switch holes out to be it either the arse or the vagina. Got that? Yeah, that would say. Something to say. Fox would just somewhat nod, and after somewhat a couple of seconds silence would then continue, truly making sure that it did sink in. And yeah, and the somewhat slight brightening of or at least somewhat cheeks and uncomfortableness from Naruto was definitely the somewhat what he somewhat need to know that it was indeed sinking in. And yeah, and it'd go somewhat that semi-flat one is known as a butt plug. That, of course, if you tried using the glass one somewhat right now, or at least with the liquid, which is a somewhat lubricant, and yes, your body naturally produces one once you get horny. But that's things that once you kind of get horny, your butt doesn't produce any, so this is mainly for somewhat your arse. And that's once your somewhat arse is wide enough, because as we said, if you somewhat tried putting in a lubed somewhat glass one, it's definitely going to be somewhat painful, as well, you're not only having to get used to somewhat your arse being stretched to that degree, which you somewhat obviously ain't, but also with it going in deep inside of you. So I've started for right now, you'll be somewhat wearing that butt plug, which will somewhat get somewhat you, or at least while your ass used to being somewhat expanded. And yes, the butt plug is somewhat wider than the actual glass dildo. Got that, and also somewhat the dildo will mainly for now be used for somewhat your vagina. And yeah, that would somewhat just nod, and if you hesitate, if I somewhat tell you when then I somewhat know you're somewhat ready, and you hesitate for too long, I will just straight up force it in. But if you continue to be hesitant even after that, I may very much rip away your own virginity and use my own. Got it? Hi. That would immediately say embarrassment, very much slight embarrassment and uncomfortableness and slight scared in the voice, though. Yeah. And I wasn't exactly sure how much it took to annoy the fox, as the fox was generally relatively, welcoming, that, and kind of somewhat understanding. Patient. But yeah, how far his patience went was definitely something Naruto was going to sort of learn. And yeah, so from there Naruto would turn of course 11, and a somewhat few months after that, not even somewhat that, somewhat a week after turning, not even somewhat that, a day or two after he turned 11, doing the 9th day, Naruto, he's female self, so Lily would be caught into it. She would enter the office, kind of asking, someone was kind of up, and if she's in trouble to it, she'd shake then, and it seems like he's slightly forgotten, though that's understandable, it has been 11 months. She'd nod, kind of trying to rack her mind what was happened 11 months ago. Fox would just face palm itself. And yeah, I should state, well, you said 11 months ago when you died that you'd potentially be leaving about the year mark, so we agreed that you'd only be working here for a year, and that after that you would be on the exact date that would be a year of working, you wouldn't have a job no more. So I'm just one reminding you, and also here to ask if you'd like to kind of renew your contract to be another year or a couple of months or more. Yeah, and of course you can come back prior to your it being a month, prior to the nearing the end. Yeah, to someone that would kind of go, why dad, I should remember, and would nod, and would go, oh, I'll tell you tomorrow or that, a decision, and it's no, I don't go just, don't, rush your decision, take a week or two to think about it. So nod and would leave and, leave the office and would get back to work. After that, someone after coming home once more, or at least having a bath, or at least doing the bath, actually, just upwards, to at least see, less upwards and more kind of, kind of upwards at the ceiling, would ask the fox what they should do, to which the fox will go, what you should do, it's kind of somewhat up to you. What do you mean up to me? You said only for a year. Well, yes, but I didn't necessarily mean a max of a year. I meant a minimum of a year, not a max. So that's my fault for not saying that. And while I kind of thought you didn't necessarily find a actual job and would end up being a prostitute, which would generally mean a minimum of a year would have been the point of where you probably would have stopped doing so, unless you got comfortable in doing it. But anyway, then if you did get comfortable doing it, I would have pulled you out. Yeah, anyway. The thing, or at least that, and you have to decide the differences that don't spend about a year and 5 or so months without training when it comes to mind mind manipulation and slight mind manipulation, or do you want to spend maybe 5 months or that 5 to 6 months of mind manipulation, as it's about generally 6 months after someone becomes a Geni that they tend to take that first single mission, if I remember correctly. The fox would say. But of course it could be different. It could be a year for you, or a year for you and your team, or a month or two. And yeah, so it's somewhat up to you, though it won't really affect anything. I decided it won't really affect that some training that I was already something used to it. The only difference that would be training slightly later, and that which would mean you'd get slightly better in chakra control, taijutsu and that, but not by much. And yeah, and so now to take, or at least would someone think about it the next morning. And so Nato had thought about it so much that or at least Nato started to kind of get dressed as as used to his female self, though as the fox would kind of notice that Nato was actually putting up some panties and that, and he didn't seem to realise what the date was. He'd go, Naruto, which would kind of snap Naruto out of his mind and go, what? Kurama, what is it? What's wrong? You may want to look twice at yourself on what today is. You'd be somewhat confused. You'd look down at yourself, and you'd go, my female self, and you'd look over to his calendar and you'd go, oh, I've got academy. And the folks go, yeah. They'd be somewhat confused why a female had turned a woman, had somewhat turned up to the academy. Now, wouldn't they? Nato, yeah, they, somewhat would, sorry about that, no need to apologise. Though, it's not the first time you've done it. Though, Nato would somewhat go a bit embarrassed at that, and true, it somewhat wasn't. And it just somewhat showed Nato's level of comfortness about just being a female, as, well, yeah, that, and when it first happened, Naruto kind of asked if he was, becoming a woman, more so mentally, to which the Fox, stated, well, there's nothing for that to become a woman, to which Naruto was confused and go, huh, what do you mean by that? And Fox would go, well, so what I mean is that me and you use the transformation actually differently. Well, yeah, still the same jutsu, but it's more so the amount of our body we transform. Because somewhat everyone, if they're transforming, into into an inanimate object, a kunai or shuriken, they're going to transform their entire body. But what I mean somewhat by all this different is when it comes to changing, genders. And that's what men and the, kids, academy, your fellows, academy, academy student classmates, all, when they're changing their gender, so when the girls are becoming boys, they change themselves physically, but only physically. They don't change themselves mentally. They don't touch their mind. Which, of course, somewhat means that say if they were to be maybe somewhat knocked out and, somewhat, and say they were to somewhat lose their memories or that, temporarily, they would know immediately that there's something wrong. They'd feel uncomfortable and that. And, yeah. That's kind of hard, but I was like that, not quite different discomfort. That discomfort is due to the fact that I've lost their memory, their mind would pretty much be like, well, I'm meant to be a woman, but I'm physically male. That's not right, and it kind of gives off a different, somewhat discomfort, something I would call gender dysphoria, the disagreement between physically and mental genders. There's a mental gender, yes, Naruto, there is. And Naruto would somewhat go, well, I guess that kind of slightly makes sense, but then why? And Fox would chuck, I do not know. But yeah, it just somewhat means that if they get knocked out or that, and lose their memories, they know that they're not, there's something wrong. Or if they have their memory suppressed, then they'd know that they're not, they're not meant to be, male or female. And yeah, me and you on the other hand both transform ourselves both mentally and physically. So the only reason why you somewhat, or at least had felt some sort of discomfort was because, or at least it was less discomfort and more just uncomfortable, as it was more so just, it was less to do with actually, am I a woman now, and more how enough am I, going to, talk to other people. It was the anxiety, it was pretty much shyness. That was exactly somewhat what you was feeling, was the now being, somewhat shy. That, even though you can, easily, go and talk to anyone, as a male, then, when you, become female, that kind of sounds very kicked in, and you didn't, that sort of nervousness and kind of scaredness you felt was due to sort of shyness. And go, oh, okay. And yeah, though of course, downside is that is if we, somehow get memory suppressed and that, we're generally going to sort of live our life like any normal woman that's lost their memories would. And that would go, so I shouldn't, it's like, well, no, well, somewhat, to be honest, it's somewhat what you've naturally been doing, so that, and also it would somewhat make you, well, it would somewhat make you be, blend in sort of with them a lot harder. Something to do, and it would make everything we've been working on all this time absolutely useless, as you'd be in a different mental state. And yeah, that would just somewhat would go okay, and yeah, and so yeah, now to somewhat of course remember that. Anyway, though, now back to somewhat present. It'd be about another day or two later when that would end up telling the person that that should be that should be working, or at least continue to work pretty much for another year. Should be 11, no 10, but 10 or 11 I think, pretty sure 11 now. Yeah, so it'd be up until the point of it'd be the exact day. So last day would be the day in which she graduates from the academy. So it'd be sort of her graduation day, or at least when she passes the test and that, or at least when he passes. So it'd be graduating, doing the sort of morning, and then pretty much last day on the sort of job that night. And yeah, with that, I'm going to end this part here, guys. So hope you guys have enjoyed this part. Definitely somewhat longer, somewhat part, as I have very much thought of this ahead of time. Yeah, anyway, guys, as I said, hope you guys enjoy this. Do tell me in the comments down below, of course, if you want a part 3. And yeah, guys and girls, hope you have a good night, good day or night, depending on wherever you are and whenever you watch this, and good bye.